All right, welcome everyone who is watching either live or on this recording of our presentation discussion. Why is Yiddish popular? Was is Yiddish modisch, which is it's not an exact translation. It's like why is Yiddish fashionable? Mode. Um, so I'm Zach Golden. I'm with Der Nister, and this is Aaron White with Culture Mercado.
Hey, everybody. It's very nice to be here and to be talking about Yiddish and its popularity, as well as its kind of resurgent popularity, which is something that we'll be talking about. As we get started, let us know where you're joining in from. What about Yiddish is important for you? And any other questions you might have. And throughout the kind of discussion, feel free to throw in some questions. And at the very end, we can probably have an open discussion as well.
Yeah. So Der Nister, for those who are marginally aware or becoming aware, is a cultural center and synagogue in downtown LA. I am one of the co-founders. The other one is sitting over here. There's Henry. The light didn't come through very well. Very sorry. And in my day job, I'm the deputy editor of the Vorwärts of the Yiddish Forward section. And the goal is to bring Jewish culture and religious practice that is open, but is a genuine continuation from its roots that I believe were interrupted over the course of the decades. It's based on 7th and Spring, on the corner of 7th Spring, in a bookstore filled with Jewish books, and we have a little prayer space, and we host events, and we're going to be having all kinds of things coming up soon that we'll get into more. But I'm also really happy that Aaron's here, and he is starting a new organization called Culture Mercado. And if you want to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, thank you. So I have started an organization earlier this year called Culture Mercado. We bring the idea of culture to the marketplace. What we do is we investigate culture and we work on kind of grassroots connections of culture, kind of underpinning a belief that culture is something that you can't necessarily legislate, but you can create from a bottoms up kind of approach. And so as we start getting off the ground, we're going to be doing a number of cultural explorations. This is our first, and I'm incredibly excited to be here with Zach, who as he said, our day jobs, I get to work with on a daily basis. I'm the director of individual giving at the Forward. And so it's really nice to be able to kind of compare and bring both of our lives together.
Yeah. So the first question that when we were talking about, okay, let's do something together, let's do it about Yiddish, but also about broader culture, is let's talk about something that people aren't talking about. And the most obvious thing that people are not talking about now is why Yiddish is popular. There's a lot of what's popular about Yiddish, or like you can find a lot of articles online about, oh, there are all these cool words you should know, or these cool content creators you should know, and all these cool programs you should check out. And it's fantastic. And I'm glad that those things are being written. There's even amongst the sort of the academic press, there's very little coverage of why it's becoming popular. And I think part of the reason for that is that comparative analysis is not really the domain of academia anymore, as far as I can tell, because that requires just too many generalizations and too much guesswork that has been abandoned as pseudoscience for like a century. But I don't think it's possible to understand what's going on around you if you don't ask the question, why is it happening?
Yeah, I mean, I think to that point, we talk about how in the 1700s, you see this a lot in memes where we talk about how there's bathtub philosophy. Somebody can come up with an entire treatise while they're, taking a walk in the woods or they're taking a shower. In fact, a lot of people talk about that. Like Rousseau, he talks about how a lot of his ideas have no backing other than he was simply walking through the forest and came up with a great idea. And he was heralded at the time as a genius. Unfortunately, with kind of the way that academia has grown and become more concrete, it kind of takes away from the ability for academics to generalize. And there is something kind of important about being able to generalize sometimes. Obviously, it's not always helpful to the way that we pursue our studies, but it can be helpful in asking these questions, like you just mentioned, Zach, that allow us to really explore as we're going to with Yiddish today.
Yeah. So who benefits from asking the question of why is Yiddish popular as opposed to what about Yiddish is popular right now? And the biggest answer to that after working for some time in the Yiddishist world is Yiddishists. Yiddishists are profoundly have a difficult time knowing why the thing that they've been interested in or have been born with or have been dedicated to for decades um, is popular, and there's a lot of very deep confusion um, about what to present these people, or like even so. There's two conflicts. One is to keep the small world that has been oppressed by various forces around it. For example, you can start with the Cold War and the association of Yiddish with being a communist that needs to be turned in, or you could go with the idea that Israel is opposed to Yiddish, and Israel is the most dominant becomes one of the most dominant sort of cultural touchstones allowed in Jewish life. Or you could go with you can keep going down the line of things that are just further marginalized people involved with Yiddish. And so when they see a sudden comeback, they kind of have two choices. One is to figure out what's popular and cater to that. And the other is to keep the status quo going and just expect that that's what everyone is interested in. But I don't think that anyone in that world benefits from not investigating what it is and why it is that their interests and that their professions are interesting to people. But it's a very hard change because this is a reverse course of decades of decline.
Yeah, and speaking of that decline, or just kind of touching on what you were talking about, Zach, you've mentioned in the past that Yiddish is more of a movement today rather than a phenomenon. We can look back, going to the New York Times in 1999, talking about this kind of Yiddish fad because there are finally Yiddish classes happening outside of New York City. And it seems like every 6 months to a year, we see these big articles in magazines, most recently, again, in the Washington Post, about how there are now Yiddish classes happening around the country. We now have 27 universities in the US that have Yiddish as a program, as a class you can take. And there are more universities kind of undertaking that investigation. So I'm just kind of curious if you can talk a little bit about, how it's a movement or what that movement looks like. And is that movement united?
So what's interesting is that that last Washington Post article, when they were trying to put a reason for the sudden growth in that, and for like, why is everyone downloading Duolingo? Why does Evo's online classes skyrocketing? The reason they give is because everyone was bored during the pandemic or realized that they were going to die or something, and just thought, oh, you know what? It would be great if I got back in touch with my ancestral language that I haven't really touched. And to me, that's like that's a reason maybe, but like it's not a compelling one, because many people have gone generations or a full lifetime and wanted to relearn their language and culture, and it wasn't because of an imminent fear of doom or like a moment of contemplation that suddenly this happened. These fit into mass sociological movements, and the movement in this situation is is one of when you're so assimilated, and like the further we go into a globalized world, the more we feel it, the more the fight for having an identity becomes present. And for a lot of people, Yiddish can become the answer. But there are a lot of there are there's a lot of factors that led to that whole story. So in other words, these articles, they are very good at covering what's happening, but their method for figuring out how it's happening is generally just interviewing a couple of people and just going with whatever they say, which is like, if there's a whole like humongous group theory about how people revive their cultures and languages and why they do it that goes back centuries, I wouldn't be relying on that only, you know.
Mhm. And do you think you can talk a little bit about where we're seeing the largest growth in Yiddish? I know that from some of your work at the Forward and some of the articles we've seen, we're seeing a growth in Yiddish, largely among a younger generation of queer Yiddishists. We're seeing it in more radical spaces. And we're also seeing more of an interest in Yiddish in the Hasidic community itself. Do you mind talking about that a little bit?
Yeah, so actually in each and every one of those situations, those are all like before we talk about Yiddish in these groups, let's talk about these groups themselves. Each of these groups, to a greater or lesser extent, were in American history seen as outsiders. That like you wouldn't want to be associated with a radical group or be known as queer in public or be like completely comfortable, as I see people now, with their Hasidic identity. um these are groups that were marginalized, and they have long held Yiddish. Like this goes back decades in every single one of these groups, radical groups. I mean, the holdovers of Yiddish before the 1940s were the communist Jews in the United States. They're the ones teaching their kids Yiddish. And then you have queer Jews have been doing this for decades as well. Hasidic Jews, they held on to this even when the yeshivish world laughed at them for being like completely backwards. Like the other ultra orthodox thought the other ultra orthodox were completely backwards. Why? Yiddish. That's why they thought they were backwards. Um, and so in a world where these groups are no longer subjects of ridicule, more people are either joining these groups, if it's the political one, are being born and are okay with identifying as a Hasidic, or are okay with identifying themselves as they are, which are in the queer groups. So these groups are actually growing bigger. And because these groups are actually growing bigger, and the sense of assertion of their identity has always had Yiddish in it, or an element of it. That's, of course, that's a natural place where Yiddish grows strongest because of the deep roots. So you can see Yiddish as growing on its own amongst these groups, especially. But these groups are growing. Now the question is, like, why is Yiddish growing outside of these groups? So the more presence these groups have in society, the more a chance there is to be exposed to these, and also to be exposed to mindsets that are completely destigmatized from Yiddish. Yiddish had a massive stigma. When I started learning more than a decade ago, like the routine reaction amongst Jews, not necessarily non-Jews, was laughter and ridicule. I said I wanted to go to Yiddish summer camp in the middle of rabbinical school, and they were like, "Why are you?" Rabbi literally told me, "Why are you wasting your time?" And now look what I'm doing. So I mean, whatever. But when as these groups have gone greater, and then more people are realizing, oh, I actually don't really have an identity to hold on to, but I actually know where it is and I know where it's coming from. And suddenly Israel, and it's like, it's so we associate Israel with a political support, but there's also a huge cultural support. As that has sort of gone down, there's now room for asking, okay, what can represent me Jewishly with Jewish culture? And then you start to see these other groups pop up and have like more of a presence and more of a say. And then we also go to the fact that, most importantly, all of these groups, no matter who they are, whether they're these core groups that held Yiddish as an identity or people that are holding on to it, are all completely assimilated. People think Hasidic people aren't assimilated. They're assimilated. You should hear them speak English. You should hear them have podcasts like they're Joe Rogan. You should hear them like have put on advertisements. Like, so this is the big point where there is no fear of Yiddish, not just because it's destigmatized, but the destigmatization is because of a complete assimilation.
And do you think that as we kind of move forward, do you think that part of this is also something having to do with this kind of pass on. We'll talk about the third generation theory.
Yeah, so complete assimilation and the desire to represent your past in a way that was more glorious than your ancestors would have seen it is the very essence of third generation theory, it's an America specific theory, but I think that its idea is universal. And especially now that we're heading more and more towards a global monoculture where everybody at least knows English and participates on the same internet, um the American dream is now becoming the world dream, and there are huge consequences to that, because part of this theory is just because you have an emerging uniform identity doesn't mean that your previous existence went away. It was not a solved question. It's something that was ignored. And so if you'd like, this is a good chance to sort of break down, if you can, Aaron, or if you will, I should say. I know you can. You just did that before the call. Marcus Lee Hansen, third generation theory, and what it means to this discussion.
Yeah, so Marcus Lee Hansen was a professor at University of Illinois in the 1930s. He was a second generation immigrant himself. He was born to Swedish and Norwegian immigrant grandparents, or sorry, parents. Uh, and he was really fascinated with trans-ethnic identity. He was kind of the first historian really looking at what that means and how that shapes things. And what's really interesting is that he presented an essay in 1937 called The Problem of the Third Generation Immigrant, where he laid out this kind of controversial law. It's just a general statement called Hansen's Law, in which he says, what the son wishes to forget, the grandson wishes to remember. The idea underpinning that is that ethnicity is diminished by immigrant children, but preserved by the grandchildren. And there are a lot of reasons for that. We see that in a number of different parts of the world. We see that largely what happens with immigrant communities is that kids are somewhat torn between wanting to live up and honor their parents and wanting to integrate with the community that they're growing up in. So what's fascinating is that historically you see that there's a lot of tension there. You see that people feel a little bit embarrassed because the language or the culture that they are a part of is not part of the dominant culture, doesn't necessarily reflect the dominant language. So a lot of times you'll see that there's a kind of a stronger push for assimilation. And before we continue, I'm just curious because I know you have some thoughts about that, Zach.
Mhm. On
On
the
that process of both assimilation among the second generation, that tension that's held.
Yeah, so Marcus Lee Hansen in his essay says basically what happens is the son, so the first generation actively very much identifies with the culture they came from. I mean, they will outwardly say they're loyal to their country, of course, but everything about their life is directly transplanted here. I mean, the core aspect of culture is that you can't change it overnight because it encompasses everything you do and everything you think. So if you wake up in the morning and all you know how to do is wash your hands, with Nagelwasser in the morning, when you come to America, like, you won't even know that there's an alternative not to do that. This is just a small, more visceral example, but every aspect of your life, when you move to another place, you might believe that you're going to adapt, but you don't know how many places you need to adapt in, how far to stand away from someone, what kind of clothing to wear, nuances in the language, perspectives that you find normal, but other people might not. People can't escape where they come from culturally when they're fully immersed in it, but their children have an active choice to make, which is whether to embrace the culture of their parents or get along with the culture of the outside world. A lot of the time, people say that the great assimilatory force in Yiddish was the desire to um, get a good job and work and the rest of that kind of thing, and that's true. But uh, I don't think that I think that those are really the first and foremost the desire of those children to like be able to move up from the life that they were in, like in tenements, let's say, and join the life of the people they see around them that live more comfortably or better or less picked on and things like that. Their choice is really dramatic. It's not just a choice where you pick one over the other as though you're picking strawberry over chocolate. The choice is abandoning everything I know versus and picking up something new, or rejecting everything new and just clinging to what's old. And that's where you get like these very sharp political and religious tensions. And then when they've made this choice to just be completely part of this new world, especially because there can be real danger in not doing that. Let's say we talked about the Cold War already. Their children will be wondering about the peculiar habits of their parents, but their parents are going to be so ashamed of any habits that they have from that they retain from their previous life, that there's a chance that the grandchild might like think that that habit that my parent does is a little weird, like, because that's how the parent sees it, that's how the parent projects it. Then the grandchild is in this situation of there is very little of that previous culture to grasp onto. And then I see all the time in Yiddish circles specifically, so many people just complaining and like whining, not whining, but like saying, oh my God, how come my parent didn't teach me any of this? Or how come my grandparents didn't teach them? And how come I don't know what's going on here? How come I can't like keep up? How come I can't catch up? The fact that the hard fact for people is that the only reason people feel free to engage in this culture of the past is because the process of assimilation was so complete that you have zero concept of the consequences of pursuing that culture before it's time, when all of it is about to go away.
Yeah, and I think what's really interesting about this essay is that there is quite a bit of space that Hansen leaves in kind of a broad interpretation. He does discuss a little bit about how having more porous cultural boundaries allows for more of a cultural retention. And we did see that historically when we speak about Yiddish. Prior to 1924, when the immigration codes were more open for Jews, there was more of a conversation happening among global Yiddish. Once we saw kind of a turnoff, a stemming of the tide of Yiddish-speaking Jews coming to America, there was a cultural cutoff. Didn't mean that conversation wasn't happening. It just meant that it was slowed or delayed. And so we started seeing a weakening of Yiddish, obviously after the Shoah, after the Holocaust, and with the death of so many Yiddish speakers, and the fact that there was a new ascendant Hebrew, especially in Israel, we see that continued kind of push against Yiddish. And so it's interesting because as we move into kind of today and talking about what makes Yiddish popular and its resurgence, part of it is that second generation issue, or the third generation issue as we're talking about. And, maybe do you think there's something more to be said about the fact that there is broadly at this point a number of people that are kind of coming to Yiddish for the first time? Maybe it was something their great grandparents spoke, but they also have an interest. So these third and fourth generation immigrants were now assimilated Americans that are just kind of broadly interested in that culture.
So Marcus Lee Hansen says that, and by the way, he's not writing in isolation. As a Danish person, 3 generations in his day, there were people starting schools to reteach Danish culture to immigrants that were 3 generations in, and which is actually what some of the Jewish centers around here are modeled after very directly, like in Camp Elanim in Ojai here. Let me think. Well, sorry, I lost train of thought of that.
So yeah, just kind of broadly talking about that third generation, I know that, again, as we bring up this essay, which we'll share with folks, one of the interesting kind of tenets that he talks about, which is a natural kind of thing, is that also in the essay, he talks about the fact that the third generation largely has a responsibility for kind of not only repopularizing the language and the culture, but also setting the tone for what the future is going to be. He kind of has this absolutist approach where he says that we have an opportunity now to popularize a moment. And in 100 years, we'll see whether Danish is still popular, which is actually a real part of the essay. We'll see if these schools are here. We'll see if, there are Danish newspapers, Danish television, Danish radio programs, not really television at the time he's writing, but he's talking about what is it that we're going to see that's going to popularize things, and that we have the responsibility to put a kind of new face on things. But what's also interesting is that in the essay, he has this kind of poignant remark where he says that it's inevitable that a culture will eventually experience a language death or a culture death. And so part of our responsibility isn't just to bring about and document our past, but to put a new stamp on the future. And so, getting back to the question that I asked about the third and the fourth generation, I'm just wondering, do you see this new cultural production happening? Do you see people coming through because of an interest in their great grandparents, or do you see an interest in people seeing this as a new opportunity with Yiddish?
I mean, I think fundamentally the way people want to see it is because of ancestral interest. I mean, I remember talking to when I was writing an article about queer Yiddish or Yiddish involvement in queer circles. The most important element was essentially like creating or piecing together the narrative that explained that Yiddish was fundamental to Jewish culture and not necessarily Hebrew, and that it was always involved in sort of a queer outlook. It was about the narrative. The narrative is serving a purpose of creating a space and I won't say legitimizing, but confirming that who you are, whoever you are, is good. Like you're fine. Like you are actually continuing a tradition that everyone around you says you're not, and you're claiming it, and you're correct. The goal of these third and fourth generations, it's funny, like how much Danish culture is there in the United States? There's actually not. It's not negligible. It's still around. You go to Solvang, a little north of here. It's still pretty real to me. I mean, there's a statue of Hans Christian Andersen that was built not too long ago in a park near there. It's changed roles. A lot of the purpose of cultural revival is psychological safety, psychological pride, like a sense that who you are, there's nothing wrong with. In fact, not just nothing wrong with, but there's something to celebrate, something to champion, something to feel good about, and not just be regretful that you don't have like something that's of your own. Now, the difference between, I think, the third and fourth generations of Danes and third and fourth generations of, say, Native Americans in one way, Jews in another. So it's the crisis of the need that people might experience in the third and fourth generation for cultural revival is much more acute in communities that are currently suffering and not just not feeling great. So Gilad Zuckerman, the linguist who speaks Yiddish as well as like one of the main people involved in Australian Aboriginal language revival, writes that language and culture is statistically and clinically shown to reduce self-harm and increase health and have literally a stronger community, having a sense that, oh, this is mine and I'm just not doing everything else poorly, is really, really critical for Indigenous communities that experience oppression directly. And a lot of this oppression is not just physical, but it's psychological. And without a state of their own, maybe lands, there's not much sovereignty. The benefit of sovereignty is the production of a norm, a production that everything you are is okay and praiseworthy and it belongs. The thing is in Denmark, even though European traditions branch off and are become quite different over time. Like you hear all the time when Danes come to, say, a Danish town here, or different ethnicities come here, they're like, oh, this is like quaint, this kind of backwards.
Mhm.
It's like seems to be nostalgia. There's the whole thing about Italians thinking Italian Americans aren't real or whatever, but there's still the possibility of a genuine connection. And there's some amount of sustenance even just by tourism alone. Here in Little Tokyo, in downtown LA, I hear people speak Japanese, people coming directly from Japan to work in the stores. There's, even though the cultures might branch off a little, because you have a homeland and because you have sovereignty, there's there's no such thing as really failing the mission. It's always you always can create a state of stasis between the production, the homeland of a production of culture, and like an appreciation for the derivations that it took elsewhere, while not really being in need of such healing. Now with the Yiddish, where it's a very unusual situation because there's no homeland, but there is a homeland for Jews that doesn't really support this national language at all. And you also have no sovereignty, but a lot of privilege in various countries. So you kind of, in my opinion, the goal of the third and fourth generation is to recognize what about us needs this, as opposed to just like, is it just we need an identity, like just, another European American, or do we need to stop self-harm? Like I can imagine that the extreme aspects of the benefits for reviving an indigenous language. I think that it's actually somewhere in the middle, because I think that a lot of Jews, Ashkenazi Jews, suffer, and we call it like a joke or comedy, or we brush it under the rug. But I actually think that we lack cultural sovereignty, and Israel's existence culturally continuously steals it away a little bit, because it represents itself as something that is actually alien to the culture that we at least we're familiar with. Um, so yeah, I know what I said is abstract and vague, but that's where I'm kind of placing the responsibility. Is it the responsibility to keep up an outpost of a larger nation? We don't have that ability to do that. Is it something to revive an indigenous sovereign movement? I mean, if we move to Poland, yes, but otherwise, no. Still advocating for that. Anyway, I'm gonna stop rambling on this, but I think you get the point.
Yeah, and I think, thank you for those comments and thank you for that. I think that one of the things that's really interesting, just touching on what you've mentioned, is the fact that the end of Hanson's essay is really fascinating. He's actually a little catty, which I appreciate. Uh, one of the things that he says is that if you look at the way that things change over time, if you look at immigration, he's like, is immigration always a good thing? And he's like, well, no, because there's going to be a backlash of prejudice and ultranationalism. And that kind of tinges today's modern conversation, especially in the US, where immigration is back to the fore. And with the fact that we're seeing rising number of immigrants around the globe due to a lot of different kind of disjunctures and a lot of kind of site-specific and cultural interventions that are causing people to move, as well as the way that states are cracking down on different cultural and ethnic groups. It's really interesting because what he's essentially getting at is that, migration is totally fine. It's the byproduct of states that's a bad thing. And I think moving on from the essay, that's really fascinating is the fact that we see this historically. You kind of bring this up with Israel a little bit. Every time we've seen a cultural or linguistic revival, it tends to have a bad byproduct of a nationalism. If you look at what they call the Irish Renaissance, also known as the Celtic Twilight or the Hebrew Revival, oftentimes they're twinned or underpinned by nationalism or nationalistic tendency. Do you think that that's something that we see with Yiddish at all?
I mean, to tell you the truth, I would like to see that with Yiddish. I think that one of the key concepts that we're lacking in the Yiddish world is the concept of why sovereignty is important. It doesn't mean that it has to be chauvinistic nationalism. I actually think we've already got that in a certain extent. Like, I think people are fearing the wrong demon, in other words. I think we already have a sense of like Yiddish is, or like traditional Jewish culture is, we have to fight for it, or it's cool and it's better than other Jewish, not better, but like there's a tension between, oh, like, I don't know, the rest of American culture or Israeli culture is illegitimate or something, which, I mean, admittedly, sometimes like it's hard not to feel that way when you're really investing very deeply in this. But I think that's already there. I think that's just human nature. I think the thing that is more necessary is to understand how much we don't have without sovereignty. Um,
Mhm.
and I don't necessarily mean like complete sovereignty, like, oh, there has to be a country that has to be founded, that has to be independent, that has to have an army and the rest of it. Um, but what's the famous quote? A language is a dialect with an army and a navy. What does that mean? That means if you actually have the power to dictate what is the norm in the area you're in, then you actually get respect. A dialect was not meant to be respectful. We think of dialect as like, oh, you speak a cool dialect. That's not what he was talking about. Dialect is basically like something you're doing wrong, something that's not standard, something that's not fitting a norm. And he understood very inherently, as did many Yiddishists from a century ago, that without a state or without sovereignty of some kind, you don't get to choose what is normal, not just dominant. You don't get to choose what's normal in the society you're in. Like if a whole group of us were started to speak Yiddish in the middle of any given, city in America, I mean, like, that's an unusual occurrence that somehow needs explaining. Some people take pride in that. Some people will go out of their way to like thumb their nose at society, and this is what they call, what was it? Jeffrey Chandler's theory of post vernacular Yiddish, in
Mhm.
which you take on Yiddish as a means of presenting, of saying something about yourself, which is what I'm talking about. But I think that as long as we don't understand that without like a Yiddish national media, a Yiddish radio, a Yiddish places to meet where the expectation is you're speaking in Yiddish, that can come privately in America.
Mhm.
That can come with governmental support in other countries, as we're starting to see. Now there's like a competition for the Yiddish Volk, the week long of just speaking Yiddish in New York, is also now happening in Poland, thanks to Polish government support. But if you don't have places where the expectation, where the norm is Yiddish and Yiddishkeit, then it's not. Then all you're stuck with is like thumbing your nose at society with post-vernacular Yiddish, which actual Yiddishists look down upon. And the reason they do is that even though they deny it, they still have the remnants of sovereignty of places where Yiddish was the norm in their minds, in their memories. So that's what I think is needed. So it's a difficult question for me in that sense.
Yeah, and I think there are quite a few scholars, and there's a lot of commentary just in general about the fact that a culture will die without new cultural production. You see, while yes, there are a lot of people coming to Yiddish, you don't see a ton of new cultural creation. I mean, you do, like, recently, for those who haven't seen it, there's a Yiddish Doritos ad, which has kind of gone viral in terms of Yiddish production. And while it's more commercial, it's showing that there's a humor, that there's a new kind of culture that's growing. And that's one of the things that I'm really interested in, because I'm curious if you're seeing places where there's new Yiddish cultural production. I know that we're seeing a lot of new Yiddish books coming out, but they tend to be translations, not a lot of new people writing in the language.
Yeah.
And then before we get into that, I think just to speak one last time to what you're talking about, which is really interesting, is that going back to the Hebrew revival and again to Gaelic, what they would start with were these meetings where everyone was forced to speak Gaelic or Hebrew. Doesn't matter how rudimentary. You could be speaking like a caveman, but the thing is that as long as you're speaking in that language, in the first, World Zionist Congress, as people were getting ready to go, they were forcing each other to speak only in Hebrew as a means of underpinning and underscoring the importance of the language, the identity, and the culture that they were trying to create. So hearing more about the so folks, hearing more about these kind of groupings that are meeting to speak Yiddish and only in Yiddish, do you think that that's a promising sign for the future creation of Yiddish culture? And that's going to be part of that underpinning popularity?
Yeah, I think at the moment the what makes it like a unconscious movement to a conscious movement hasn't been breached yet. It hasn't been, that bridge hasn't happened yet. I think that the people involved in like Celtic or Hebrew revivals or any kind of cultural fight, I think are generally more aware of why they're doing it than a lot of people in the Yiddish world. And I'll get to why that's important in the question of cultural production. So I think that there are many people I know who are very involved in Yiddish know that being in Yiddish, just the fact of it, is very comforting. It's very like of that's it's our world. I like being in it. Um, that makes for a lot of great cultural consumption. It doesn't make for a lot of amazingly high amounts of cultural production. Cultural production takes a lot more effort and a lot more work, and you have to be willing to punish yourself with the embarrassment of speaking the language poorly, or like going past the point of like caring about whether someone thinks what you're doing makes sense or not. The move, and that's like sort of a national or sovereigntist kind of mindset. We're not there yet. I think that a lot of people who create Yiddish production are, well, we kind of are with the Hasidic movement. That's why that's why the Doritos ad came out of there. That's why like there's like a weird Office series in Yiddish that was made there in that community, because they understand that they're responsible for their own entertainment, and they're to keep the sovereignty that they do have. You know, um, but for right now, I think a lot of the cultural production that happens is simply just slotting into what's popular or what's provided. So the Yiddish Book Center is really the progenitor of a lot of cultural creation now. It's either their influence or them directly. So that has to do with Yiddish literature of the past, why it's good. People like doing skits on it, putting those sorts of things on TikTok, having like the quotes of writers being sort of the thread that goes through all of these things, reenacting aspects in them. And so we have this like very strange paradox where sort of the glories of the past are the province of secular Yiddish culture in terms of its production, and Doritos and AI is the cultural production of the Hasidic community, of the
Mhm.
Hasidic world, which is supposed to be so backwards. So how did we end up back? How did the secularist Yiddish world end up backwards compared to the Hasidic world? And the answer is that the Hasidic world has an incentive, has a consciousness that they will achieve sovereignty by keeping their community already speaking Yiddish present in the 21st century. Whereas I think here it sort of is the more casual third generation hypothesis of like, let's glorify our past to sort of like add to our present. um like, you know, that's what happened. There's the third generation hypothesis is that was revisionist history, was like glorifying, was reproducing culture of the past for the present. And this also has a huge presence in the Yiddish world altogether. After the Holocaust, there were humongous amounts of Yiddish literature published and written to preserve the past, but more out of like a trauma response of like, well, this civilization is dying, rather than say, let's glorify ourselves, or let's add to our sense of self. I think that the difference to get into this sort of sovereigntist mindset and therefore actually have modern cultural production is to acknowledge the fact, or I guess it may not be a fact, but that I think Ashkenazi Jews in this country do suffer mentally, and suffer from alienation more so than the average person, because it's just so foreign what goes through our minds that it's very routine that I meet people who are just suffering. I meet a lot of, you know, maybe it's just because I'm in the religious world, but I meet a lot of people who are really suffering and that when they're exposed to their own culture and their own like language, is a sense that, oh, all the weird things that I do that we associate with various pathologies, pathologized diseases of like, oh, I'm so this and ADHD and this and that or whatever, I'm shut out of society, can easily be traced to Jewish culture. And like in fact, a lot of pathologizing was done by people meant to who wanted to stigmatize Jews in history. There's a lot of research on this. So I think that if we acknowledge that Jews suffer from a lack of sovereignty, in that there's like a lot of mental issues, there's a lot of alienation, there's a lot of how come I can't fit in anywhere, there's a lot of there's something wrong with me, and it happens on a mass scale. That's the symptom of not having cultural control over your life. And so when that consciousness is reached, then it's not going to be about like, let's take something out of the past and make it beautiful. It's going to be like, when do we start speaking Yiddish now? When do we start like talking about current events in Yiddish now? When do we start making a brand new entertainment with brand new ideas and style now? That has nothing to do or very little to do with the past. That moment hasn't come yet.
Yeah, and I think that's a really interesting and a very deep, poignant point there. I think what's interesting is that there was a German sociolinguist, Florian Kolmas. He's still alive and still writing. He wrote about a book called Language and Economy, and he talks about basically the economic value of language and how languages have an internal cultural economy and how that's adapted to the demands of the external economy. Historically, again, we've talked about all these different things that have affected historical Yiddish and the historic Yiddish culture going into today. And without trying to be too, I think, flagrant or controversial, or without, trying to compare apples to oranges, historically, the Jewish community of America, especially after the 1930s, really kind of coalesced around the Hebraist identity and the founding of Israel, which kind of really set itself in Hebrew. We also saw that Yiddish was kind of seen as the language of losers, which is a bad way to put it, but
that's the best way to put it, honestly, because that's what it was supposed to feel like.
Yeah, and the thing is that with today's rapidly changing situations in Israel, and the fact that a large American population, especially of younger Jews, feels disconnected from Israel, do you think that this is changing that internal economy, that internal cultural economy, swinging things back towards the investigation and exploration of other Jewish languages, whether that's Yiddish or Ladino or
ironically, I think that the biggest victims of Israel losing its shine or luster or purpose, I would say, actually at this point, are Israelis. Israelis are now have been turning to Jewish languages faster than Americans have, by far. Like now it's pretty routine in Israel to hear pop songs with like Judeo-Arabic, Yiddish. Like there are better produced Yiddish pop songs in Israel than have come out of the United States in terms of secular Yiddish. Now there's like such a sort of recognition that the Israeli national project on a cultural level has kind of like there's not much more cultural production that is really happening anymore, because I think that the collective everyone's very settled into an Israeli identity and are probably experiencing the exact same things that are happening in the United States. But two, I think that Israel, as much of a country, was a movement. I mean, that's what they mean by Zionist movement. And I think that all of its goals were maybe not accomplished, but like whatever we were supposed to accomplish is settled in some sort of way. And now there's sort of a looking backwards as to, okay, who were we before this all happened? Maybe, this Israeli culture is internally oppressive in some way, that it was meant to, that it was new and artificial and alien. And so in Israel itself, there's a lot of turning backwards to this. And I think it's actually for that fact that the hold over the United States culturally and otherwise is lessening, because I think there's just less Israelis who are so convicted about the whole movement and ideal, and the need for it, and are also similarly convicted about the need to discover who you actually are. Now, the question is, like, how urgent is that discovery? That's what I meant by the degree of cultural production. But the economy of Yiddish is going up everywhere in the world, and the decline of Israel is not just felt in this cultural sense. It's not just felt in the United States amongst people who are like, I don't know how to latch onto this culture anymore, that I don't have this amazing commonality with. I mean, Jews in America used to have amazing commonalities with Israel. Israel was the representative of Jews as strong. Golda Meir literally spoke American with an English with an American accent. She's from St. Louis. Like these people were us. That stopped being true after a while. So yeah, like the cultural economy is not really the rise of Yiddish. I would say it's the diminishment of Israeli culture as a defining force in Israel as much as it is elsewhere.
Yeah, thank you. And, I think as we kind of approach the end here, I think my final question is, we've talked a little bit about the underpinnings of what's creating a grounds for why Yiddish is popular. But I'm curious as to whether there are any spaces that we definitely can point to help popularize Yiddish. I know that, you have a lot of Yiddishkeit in popular culture. I've had some friends recently, now that the nanny is somewhere on streaming, starting to ask me about Yiddish references because they're ever present in that show. And we do see a lot of Yiddishkeit working its way into cinema, into television. And while it happens to just be offhand words, where do you see cultural production and the opportunity to popularize Yiddish going? And who do you look to as an influence? Who do you think is a good person helping to popularize Yiddish today?
I mean, I think the first person I think of who really is a very capable cultural creator outside of everything else is Michael Yashinsky. He creates a lot of plays in Yiddish, and like I think Aaron Bendich, who has a klezmer label but also puts on kleztronica, like klezmer electronica out in New York. These are kinds of things that like keep what's going on modern, that keep what's going on exciting. And I think that basically anybody who's genuinely very modernly minded and can create, they're going to find a lot of currency with Yiddish production, because it's going to feel very real and very ours. It's not going to be a lot of the biggest misconception about Yiddish is that it's something of the past and for the past. And each person who can create to destroy that illusion is another notch, in my opinion, of like sovereign consciousness. And yeah, and with that, I think we can end there and open it up for questions if anybody's interested, either in the chat or on screen or anything like that. But thank you for coming, and thanks for everyone who might be watching afterwards.
Yeah, thank you so much.
But if yeah, so we'll give it a few seconds. But if nobody has anything coming up, I think we'll find a way to have more of these, or to see what else can happen between Culture Mercado and Dernister.
Yeah, looking forward to it. Thank you.
All right. Well, we'll have a good rest of your day, and this will be online soon.
Bye, everybody.